Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and we have so many viewer games and questions that I don't think I'm going to have time to go through all of them. So what I'm going to do is go through a bunch and maybe go for 30-40 minutes, see how it's going, and then leave some for the next time too. So we begin with a game that was submitted by Krumov, or Krumo, I'm not sure how he wants to pronounce it, and he had black as a Class D player, and it's a very, very sharp game. And okay, he has black, so let me flip it around. And I have some comments about this opening. So black is playing the Moscow, or the anti-Moscow gambit here, or white's playing the anti-Moscow gambit, black's going into it. And this is one of the absolutely most sharp, crazy, insane, bonkers, theory-laden lines in all of chess. And it's a lot of fun, but it also strikes me as slightly crazy for a Class D player to do this. It's not because you have to sort of wear a coat and tie to play openings like this, but it's just that to play it, really you have to spend quite a bit of time studying theory. And I think until you reach a certain point, it's not that you shouldn't know any theory, and you can play whatever you want to, but to play it right, you have to spend so much time working on it. And I think there are other things that are probably a better use of time up to a certain point. I mean, when you get to be Anand and Topalov, then you have to spend basically all your time on theory. The joke is the only time they study endgames is when their opening preparation continues all the way through into an ending. Okay, and it kind of goes in between. I mean, so the stronger you get, you spend a little bit more time on opening theory. But I don't know, this just seems to me a little bit of a misplaced priority. But, if you just enjoy playing it, then, go for it. I mean, it certainly is a very fun line. Okay, well, white plays something a bit strange here, bishop to e5. And it's kind of strange because, first of all, the bishop can sometimes go to d6. There are some lines where black plays bishop to g7 and knight b to d7. There's no real threat with bishop to e5, and it takes that square away from both the knight on f3, which sometimes goes there, and the pawn from e4 sometimes pushes as well. So it's really kind of odd. Okay, so knight b to d7, yeah, perfectly natural move. Bishop b2, bishop b7, queen c2, knight takes, pawn takes. And here I think if black just plays knight to d7, he's simply winning. We're just going to line up on this weakness here on e5. Just play bishop to g7, queen c7. And black is really safe. I mean, you can see that white's minor pieces are all pretty well restricted at this point. Thanks to the pawn structure. And white's pawn on e5 doesn't really help him either. So this should just be winning, ultimately, for black. Just because he'll be up 2 pawns for no real compensation. But black played knight to g8, which was pretty strange. Okay, you can go to e7 and g6, but if you think about what it does there, it attacks the pawn on e5, which you could have done right away. So this is a little bit overly fancy, I think. Maybe, I guess, black wanted to prevent queenside castling, but that really isn't such a big deal. White's king isn't going to be so incredibly safe over there that it's worth wasting 2 tempi to stop that. Okay, so anyway, knight g8, rook d1. I think queen c7 is more logical, but queen b6 is fine. Castles, but now, okay, bishop c5 I think is, again, perhaps not best. Just kind of get on with it. Knight e7, knight g6. And bother that pawn. Okay, and also another good idea I think is rook to d8. I mean, what white has going for him is, at least in theory, the possibility for some kind of attacking play. I mean, he does have a lead in development, although his pieces really aren't functioning very well. So rook to d8 is actually not so bad, trying to get rid of some lumber. If he takes, you take with the king and play king c8, and it's as if you castled. Okay, so bishop c5, a4, a6 is okay, but I prefer knight e7, but okay. Black gets there, and everything is still okay. All right, knight to g4. Now here, black played bishop to e7, which doesn't spoil anything, but black could also even just play king e7. The king is perfectly safe here, and it connects the rooks, so the rooks can, rook can come to d8 next, and h5 is ready, perhaps, and black is doing just fine. And king f8 followed by king g7 is also perfectly good. So bishop e7 I don't really like so much, as it's, well, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is, well, let's say 3 reasons. Okay, so one is we're retreating a piece that was on a better square. Secondly, it doesn't take care of our king safety issue, really. And third is that after knight f6 check, I don't really want to take, because then his e-pawn survives, and it constricts my king further, which keeps my rooks disconnected. So we'll see this in a moment. King h1, h5, check, takes, takes. And again, black is still okay, but this is kind of annoying. So you know, I could castle kingside, which is kind of a little bit crazy though, because of bishop h5. I can't castle queenside. I can't play king e7. So this, I think, is getting at least slightly dangerous for black. It's still fine. And what he should play is g4, trying to remind white that his own king might have a little bit of trouble. But instead, black played e5, which was actually more or less a blunder. And we'll see why in a moment. So white played rook to d6. Queen d2 is probably even better. Black played rook to d8. And now, see if you can figure out what white to move should do here. So white missed a big opportunity at this point. Okay, well, the move that white played is not so good. He played rook d8, queen d8, rook d1, queen f6, and black finished actually very well. So he played very, very nicely the rest of the game. But we don't need to look at it. I mean, you can find it on the questions, or sorry, the viewer games thread. But you know, he played it perfectly well. But what both players missed was the killing shot knight to d5. And this would have been impossible when the pawn was back on e6, but now that it's gone, that move becomes available. And the problem is for black that after queen a5, queen c3, white loses the queen, because on queen c3, there's knight c7 check, king f8, and see what I said about the f6 pawn, rook takes d8 mate. So, you know, this is the kind of thing that happens in these games. I mean, they're very crazy, they're very tactical. And so from that point of view, it's maybe okay to play it just for the tactics practice. But anyway, if you like it, play it. You'll have lots more games like this that are crazy and go back and forth. Okay, so on to the next one. This is between Flint Eastwood, not to be confused with the movie star, and El Mago Vago, or Vago. Okay, so here we have, submitted by White, who's also, like Krumov, a D player. So, yeah, we have the Kozio variation, which actually isn't as bad as it looks. So it looks really strange. Black, just to avoid doubling his pawns potentially, after bishop takes c6, is putting his knight on his very passive square. It blocks the bishop on f8. Just doesn't seem like it should be okay. But in fact, it's actually pretty playable. It's really not so bad. White can play a number of ways. He can play c3. Can castle is in the game. Can play d4. But I think the main move now is, ironically, knight to c3. So black kind of misplaces his knight, at least relative to our usual expectations of what happens in the Ruy Lopez. And then white, in turn, seems to misplace his knight by blocking the c3 pawn. But, in fact, it's a very sharp approach, and it seems to be quite good. So g6, d4, takes, and now white can choose between knight takes d4 and knight to d5. So knight to d5 threatens mate right away. So bishop to g7. Now bishop to g5, which threatens to take on c6 and then take on e7. So h6, the point that if bishop c6, black takes the bishop on g5. So bishop f6, takes, king f8, and now white can either play knight takes d4 or castle. And in both cases, white's doing pretty well. But not like a winning game or anything. I mean, it's just it's a slight edge kind of variation. Okay, well in the game we had castles. Black played a6. G6, I think, is the usual move. And then on c3, bishop g7, d4, and then one very sharp line is takes, and d5. And a bit more sane is to kick the bishop away and then either castle or play d6. And then still strive for d5 at some later point. Okay, so in the game, black played a6 first, then b5. Oh, let me show you this really cool variation. So this is just amazing. So d6, c3, bishop d7, d4, knight g6, rook e1, bishop e7. Okay, and we have a few more developing moves. Okay, and in this position, white sometimes plays d5, but also bishop takes c6. And I was going through this in the database, just looking at some of the lines from here. I mean, I knew the knight c3 stuff, but I didn't really know this sub-variation. And then there's knight to h4. And I was just looking at this, and my first thought was, this must be some kind of mistake in the database. I mean, okay, you're doubling the pawns, with taking on f3, but this doesn't look serious at all. But in fact, it is. It's incredible. So white should just play knight 1 to d2 and simply give the piece back. Because, okay, if bishop to a4, bishop f3, gf3, queen c8, and white can get out of this with a draw, but amazingly, there's just nothing more than that. So, for instance, knight e3, queen h3, threatening knight takes f3 check, king h1, knight f3, and knight f1. But now we just go back. Knight h4 threatens queen to g2 mate. He's got to block it, and then knight f3 again. So it's pretty remarkable, that variation. Anyway, as I said, if you're playing white, I would recommend knight c3 here and not getting into any of that. But still, cool variation. Okay, so let's move on here. Here black starts to misplay things. So black played bishop to c5, which is really, really cooperative. I mean, the right move is bishop to e7. It's just a game here. Probably white's a little bit better, but nothing earth-shattering. So bishop to c5, d4, takes, and black errs again. So he has to go back to e7, but white's clearly much better there. Well, somewhat better there, thanks to his pawn center. But instead, black played bishop to b6, which just loses more or less right away, but white lets him off the hook. So knight to g5, threatening to take on f7, castles, queen h5, h6, and here, what should white do? So there are at least a couple of good moves here. Well, in the game, white played queen takes g6, and this is not bad, but it's just much better to play knight f7 first, rook f7, and then queen takes g6, and this is just winning outright. So instead of this, white's going to end up ahead the exchange in a pawn. So instead, white played queen g6, h5, bishop g5, and black blundered here with queen to e8. He could have survived with knight to e7. It was worse, but he avoids getting mated and avoids any kind of big material losses here. But queen e8 was a terrible blunder. Now white let him off the hook with interest, in fact, with bishop to h6. So it's the right idea, but after bishop takes d4, black survives and is in fact even a little bit better. So the right move is just bishop to f6, and there's absolutely no way to stop checkmate on the very next move with queen takes g7. Okay, so it's bishop h6, bishop d4, and here white got a little too optimistic. Oh, it's kind of fun. I mean, I like the spirit in which white played this game, but there were a lot of mistakes. So he played rook to d1. He should just play knight to d2. I mean, there's no reason to sacrifice the rook. And knight to d2 also brings another piece into play. So rook to d1 takes, of course, why not? f4. Black makes another good move here, knight to e7. And here black is just winning. After queen g3, he can just take the rook. Because on e5, now he has knight f5. So that stops the mate threat. The bishop on h6 drops next. Just game over. So a better move is f5, but then black can play a very important move, d5. And it's always good to play d5 rather than d6 in a position like this, because we want to make it more difficult for the bishop on b3 to exert any influence. I mean, why let it into the game? And it's not like we should really care that we're giving away a pawn with d5. I mean, black is up a rook and a pawn. So if he loses one pawn, but it helps him to break the attack, who cares? So that would be terrific for him. Okay, well instead black played king to h7. He's still better after this, but not as much better. Bishop to g5. Now the threat's to play queen h4 check, and bishop takes e7. So he plays knight to g6, check here, queen h5. And, okay, so now the threat is back to play queen takes g6. Alright, so black has to make a decision here, and there are at least 3 moves that are worth considering. See what you can come up with. Or at least 2 moves worth considering, and maybe the third move shouldn't have been considered. Okay, well, one move that's, I think, okay is bishop takes a1, queen g6, again d5, bishop d5, and then bishop to e6. And after bishop a8, of course, we just take the queen. And, of course, if he moves the queen away, then plenty of material comes off the board, and black is up the exchange more or less for nothing. So this should win. Okay, even better, I think, although a little bit sharper, is queen takes e4. Okay, so the knight on g6 is now protected because of the queen. And, black still wants to take the rook on a1. And if knight to d2, check here, bishop takes a1, queen g6, and now black has a very good move. Queen takes bishop, and that just ends the contest there. So black is up a rook and 2 pawns here, and it's too much. Okay, well in the game black came up with knight h8, which it does take care of. There's two things that can be said about it that are good. So one, of course, is that it saves the knight, and secondly, it maybe helps to protect the f7 pawn. But it puts the knight on a really bad square, and it becomes very vulnerable there too. Again, white should play knight to d2, but played e5. Bishop takes a1, queen g4, and black is winning here too. The e5 was a big mistake. Okay, so the right move here again would have been d5. Excuse me. Again, hitting the queen, but also blocking the bishop on b3, and can maybe follow up with c6. But black played d6, okay, queen g3, and again, you should just play bishop to e6, and it's a simple win. Instead, black blundered, and this time there was no more amnesty to be had. Played d takes e5, and now white just forces mate. So see how fast you can find it. Bishop f6. Okay, the threat's queen g7 mate, and there's no way to get out of mate in a couple of moves. So, for instance, if g6, then queen h4, and there's absolutely nothing that can be done about queen h8 mate. Black can delay it by one move by playing bishop to d4 check. White takes the bishop, and then plays queen h8 mate. Okay, in the game, it was knight to g6, and white just took e4, queen g7 mate. Okay, so, white had this, played with a lot of energy, a lot of mistakes too, but I like this kind of caveman approach. I think it's a great way to learn how to play and to get better at tactics. Okay, the next game was a Caro-Kann submitted by black. I think his handle is Hap, and so this is a game he played against a 1755, and it was a Caro-Kann, and I'm going to zip ahead to this point. And here the position is just basically pretty equal, a very typical kind of classical Caro-Kann position, and really, this looks like it would be a pretty tame game for quite a while. But in fact, things get sharp pretty quickly here. So from this point, both players start to the game gets very sharp, and both players start to make some inaccuracies. So c3, I think, is not really the best move, and the reason is that I think black should just take, and this position is actually slightly favorable for black, not white, because this bishop is actually pretty poor. I mean, the big problem for it is that the pawn on d4 really impedes it, and so this knight on d5 is fantastic. The second knight can come to c4, and black should just have no real worries here at all. So it's not winning for black, but it's a little bit better for him. Okay, in the game it was knight c4 and bishop to c1, and here there's a long series of moves where really both sides miss various tactics, although it's usually the same one or two tactics over and over again. So this is a good place to see if you can figure out what black can play. So black has something that's actually pretty good here. Well, the move that he should have played is knight takes a3 check, and this is actually winning. So ba, knight c3, king b2, knight d1, rook d1, and now rook to d8. So material is even-ish at the moment. It's rook and 2 pawns for black against 2 knights, but white is going to lose more material because of the pin on the d file. So for instance, bishop to e3, e5, goodbye knight. Black wins. Okay, so black missed this though and played a6. And now white has something that's, okay, I'm not sure if it's quite good, but it's extremely interesting. So white could play knight takes e6 here. It's not bad. It's just doesn't win either. So takes. White's won a pawn, but black gets it back with this, with a fork of his own. Rook e6 check, king f7. And again, it looks as if things have gone wrong for white, but rook takes a6, and turns out not to be so bad. So if bishop takes g3, then rook to a7. If I remember correctly, well, I don't have to remember. I can just look for myself, and that's not so bad. Or no, sorry, just rook to d7 check and rook takes b7 is actually pretty strong, because black's king is going to be a bit clumsy wherever it goes on the back rank. Or maybe f8 makes more sense, and rook b7. So this rook is out of play, not very happy. So white's doing pretty well there. And on b takes a6, then rook f5 check, and then rook takes f2. And white has 2 pawns for the exchange. So it's interesting. All right, instead of this, though, white played f4. And again, black could play knight takes a3. All right, castles, knight e4. Okay, so now c3 is covered, so that doesn't work. Probably the best is, again, to trade, even though white's not taking with the pawn this time. I think black is still in very good shape in a position like this. You can see that black has, all these pieces, all of these pieces on light squares with very nice control, while white's bishop, it's pretty hemmed in by his own pawns on dark squares. And because white controls all these light squares, it makes it very hard for white to get his pawns off of dark squares onto light squares, which means, in turn, that the bishop on c1 is going to have an unhappy life. Okay, instead of that, black played bishop to e7, which, it's not bad. It's very natural. Now, g4, b5, and now kind of a double mistake, knight to g5. So it's a mistake because I think, first of all, bishop takes g5, f g5 isn't bad in its own right, messing up white's pawns a little bit, and again leaving him with that bad bishop. But knight e4 or knight to g5 was also wrong, because now again c3 is underprotected, and black can again go for this exchanging combination. So white doesn't have to lose the piece this time, but still black is much better here. So again, rook and 2 pawns for bishop and knight, but white's pawn structure is not very good. The g5 pawn is weak. The bishop on c1 is looks like a dominated checker piece at the moment. So black is clearly better. Okay, instead black played h6, and here white missed a tactic, so he could have taken. And it's just a simple removing the guard combination. So now the knight is attacking f8, and the rook's attacking d5. So black should probably counter sack just for the 1 pawn, but white's better in this position. Even material, but white's activity and the threats of the g pawn is more important. Okay, instead white went back to f3, which still leaves c3 unprotected, so black could still play knight takes a3. Okay, black played a5 instead, and now white could just take on b5, and that seems like it's okay, but played f5. Okay, now black could play bishop takes a3, so b4, ab, king c2. And this is another mistake. So takes, and here I'm really surprised. I mean, because now the c pawn is really underprotected. I mean, so you can see the knight's hitting it, the rook behind it is hitting it, and so I would, if I were black in a game here, unless I was really short of time, I mean, I would spend as much time as I thought I needed, either finding some tactic that works where I can collect on c3, or going at it until I was absolutely sure that there was just nothing. So knight to a3 check is simple and strong, I think. The point is on bishop takes a3, just rook c3 check, and you've got 2 guys hitting the bishop. So you regain your piece, and you have a pawn up, and you've penetrated as well, so this is just winning. So king d2, rook a3, and your pieces are active, and you're threatening bishop to b4 check. Maybe you can play rook b8 and rook b2 and go for an attack as well. So black should just be winning here. White can play a little bit better with king d3, but you still can just take with the knight or with the rook, and it's a free pawn with a good game. Okay, instead black played bishop to f6, then we had takes, rook e6, and again, knight c3 works. So you always got to look at these things. I mean, you got this great rook on c8, and his king's sitting there, and you've got a lot of active pieces. I mean, there should just be something. So, well, in fact, black did really look and found an idea, which again tries to exploit it, but it's not as clean. So takes, knight e3, king d2, takes, and here black blundered. So he played rook to c4. And from here, white was able to consolidate. And there's a blunder on the last move, but it doesn't really matter. The job is basically done here, and it's a matter of white finishing up. So here, though, black has a big improvement over rook c4. So I mean, look at all the vulnerable pieces that white has. So the knight is vulnerable, and you can see, for instance, there's the possibility of pinning. Okay, this bishop on c1 is under attack too, and so that suggests, well, maybe, if we could attack it a second time, hey, we can win it. So the right move here is just bishop takes d4, knight d4, rook f1. And in this position, okay, it's not hopeless. I mean, white's only down the exchange for a pawn, but still, it's black who stands better here. So a very interesting game, and I think a tactically rich game. But unfortunately, both players missed a lot of things there. But once you start seeing these patterns over and over again, it becomes easier to see them the next time. So I hope that'll help. Okay. I think there was one more game that I wanted to look at this time around. Oh no, actually, yeah, I wanted to take a quick look at the viewer questions. There's some more games that I'll come back to, but I think I wanted to handle some of the viewer questions first. Okay, so the first one I'm going to look at comes from Keenan, who's a Class A player, and he asks, well, it doesn't specify, but I assume he means this. So he says, can you explain to me the importance of the move c6 as black on the third move of the ready? It doesn't control the center, and it defends a pawn that's already being defended by another piece. Well, okay, fair enough. It's not forced to play c6 either. I mean, there are other moves that are possible. But one of the main points behind it, believe it or not, is to protect the b7 pawn. And it's not because the pawn on c6 is going to move backwards. So let me explain what I mean. Okay, after c6, black usually plays bishop to f5 or bishop to g4. So let's see. Well, what happens if black plays bishop to f5 right away? Well, c4. Now, black can play c6, okay, but then it's not really clear how much we gained by that by that little finesse. In fact, this is at least okay for white. Whereas if you play c6 right away on c4, maybe you can take the pawn and give white a hard time trying to regain it. But okay, let's suppose we're just resolutely against c6 because it still doesn't develop any pieces or control the center. So let's say we play e6. Okay, well then queen to b3, and now it's kind of awkward trying to defend the b pawn. If we play b6, then this diagonal comes wide open, and that's not fun. If we play queen c8, well, the queen's kind of misplaced, and well, what else are we going to do? So that, I would say, in a nutshell, is one of the main points behind c6. So we're doing really three things. I mean, first of all, we are controlling the center a little bit. I mean, it does help to protect d5. Secondly, we're trying to blunt this bishop's diagonal against c4 and all kinds of other tricks to open it up on the long diagonal. And thirdly, we're making it very easy to handle any threats to the b7 pawn because we can just play queen to b6 or queen c7 with no difficulty. Okay, next question is from Bystanders, who asks, well, about the King's Indian. He says, okay, that he's seen some videos I've made on it, and one by International Master Castellano, and he's just a little bit curious about white's f3 move and black's f4 in the classical variation. So he says, in many cases, when black plays f5 and knight's f6 to put pressure on white's d-pawn, white almost automatically plays f3 to support his e-pawn. But I wonder, is f3 that necessary? What would happen if white just protects his e-pawn with a piece? And after white's f3, it seems that black almost always plays f4 immediately. I understand the point is to play g5 and g4 to attack white's f-pawn, but is it necessary to play f4 immediately? What would happen if black delays f4 and plays something like rook f7 first? Just curious. Okay, well, I think those are decent questions, certainly. But I think there's, generally speaking, a pretty good answer. Now, this is an example of a very typical variation. It's a little bit unfortunate in a way, because here white kind of has to play f3. Well, it doesn't really have to, but often plays f3 because of the threat of f4. Well, we could do the variation with let's say knight to d3, f5, bishop to d2. Okay, so here's a line where white doesn't play it right away. He can, but doesn't. But all right, what he gains out of this is that if black plays f4, then white has bishop to g4. So that's one reason why sometimes white can be a little sneaky and try to delay it, because after, let's say, knight f6, this exchange is generally speaking a bit more or less in white's favor, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that there's like a weak square on e6, although it's hard for white to get there, certainly anytime soon. But it also makes white a lot safer on the king side. So there's not going to be any bishop takes h3 sacrifices after stuff like the pawn coming to f3, g5, g4, g3, white plays h3. This kind of thing has happened many times where black has played bishop takes h3 and destroyed the white king side. Well, it's not going to happen now. There's no bishop. But, okay, so that's why black plays knight f6 here. This is normal. Okay, well, but now what can white really gain by delaying? If you play bishop to f3, your bishop is kind of vulnerable there. Black will play f4 anyway. So let's take a look. And then you're going to play g5, g4. And, what's this bishop doing here? I mean, it's just a target now. So it's not clear that there are really even all that many good ways for white to defend the e-pawn with pieces. Secondly, I don't really see why white would generally want to do that. Just because whenever you have to defend something, most of the time you want to defend as economically as possible. So for the job of defending a pawn, at least on principle, when possible, all things being equal, you'd want to defend it with a pawn, right? You don't want to spend, you don't want to use a really powerful piece doing a job a pawn can do. So f3 for that reason also, so f3 for that reason is a very economical and normal move to play. Now here, why does black play f4 right away? Will he turn into a pumpkin if he plays rook to f7 or something like that? Well, no, he won't, but at a certain point, he's going to have to play f4, g5, g4 anyway. I mean, there's not really any other, or there are very, very few other attacking ideas. So, yeah, I mean, maybe he can rearrange the chairs on the deck for a couple of moves, but ultimately he's going to have to play f4 anyway. And there's really nothing that's gained by delaying it. I mean, there's probably some very specific sub variations somewhere where it's good to make little finesses, but by and large, just f4, g5, h5, g4, get on with it. So it's a race, and the faster you get there, the better your chances. Okay, next question, and this is from Krumov, who we mentioned earlier from one of his games, and he asked about how should white asked about combating the modern Benoni and the Benko gambit. And he adds, okay, he wants to have me recommend some lines, but he's not interested so much in a bunch of detailed variations, but a sort of positional overview of these lines. Well, all I can say is that you're probably asking a bit too much. At some point you have to kind of get your feet wet and get your hands dirty and kind of dig in there to mix some metaphors. So all I'll say about the Benko and the Benoni is this. So I'll just start from this position here and essentially say that what black is trying to achieve in the Benko, in the kind of classical main lines, is a lot of play on the long diagonal. So he's going to play bishop to g7, say d6, castle. So this guy is great. This rook is going to end up on b8 after, let's say, knight b to d7. The queen comes to a5. And black is trying to create as much play as he can on the A and B files in conjunction with the bishop on g7. So white's job really, in at least the classical lines, the classical main lines, is to neutralize black's pressure and to very, very slowly bring the extra pawn to bear. Now, you asked about the modern Benoni, so I'll mention a possible anti-Benko line, which you might consider, b6. And the point is that you end up with kind of a modern Benoni-like structure. So it's not exactly the same, but you might consider that. There are some important differences. Okay, so the modern Benoni, let's start from this position here. And from here, what I want to say is that at a very, very general level, white's play against the modern Benoni is ultimately, in most cases, going to focus on the move e5. So there are variations where white plays f4 right away and tries to jam this e-pawn down black's throat. There are lines where he doesn't play it right away but plays it very quickly. But even when white doesn't play for this right away, there are still many more lines where it's something that white is trying to prepare in the long run. Now, what black is going for in the modern Benoni, okay, again, he's going to fianchetto this bishop, and that gives him some play on the diagonal. And black is also going to try to expand on the queen side. He's got this 3-on-2 majority over here against just these two pawns. So black would like to try to create a meaningful space advantage over there. Ultimately, one of the things that black would really love to play is b5. And if you can achieve this, then it often gives him good chances. So that's why almost all the time when you see a6 by black in a modern Benoni, white almost reflexively plays a4. And black has various ways of trying to make b5 happen. So one is to play, instead of a6, knight a6, knight c7, rook b8, even bishop d7 if necessary, a6 and b5. Okay, so anyway, that in a very, very broad overview is what's going on. So, look, you got to do some research on your own, come up with lines. There are a lot of lines that are fine. Nothing that just promises an obvious clear advantage for white against either opening. But if you understand what both sides are basically trying to achieve, then that gives you a better chance of not only figuring out what line to play, but of understanding how to play it and of finding your way when you get out of book in an actual game. Okay, so let me take a quick look at, there were two more viewer questions, and I think we can go through these without going too long. So this next one was submitted by the Chesser, who was a Class D player, and asks, notes that it's white to move here, obviously, he's in check, and asks if white can deliver some kind of discovered or cross check, or if black can give checks forever and draw the game. Well, queen endings are, as most of us know, can be extremely tiring and exhausting. There's so many checking sequences, and you're trying to find ways to avoid checks. But here, fortunately, it's a pretty easy draw for black. And there are a couple of reasons for this. So one is that white's king is pretty exposed. And the second reason is that there are many lines where black can trade queens and let white queen first, but then draw with the a-pawn on the 7th rank. So let me demonstrate what I mean. Okay, so first of all, queen c4 is no good. Not because of queen takes g6. Of course, this would be a big, big blunder, as opposed to the little blunders. Okay, it's a blunder because of this mate in 2. But by throwing in queen f6 check first, the problem is solved. So now the king has to move too far away from black's king, and so there's no real problem. And if he goes to c2, queen takes g6 comes with check. And if he goes to d2, then there's no check, but there's also no mate for white. So queen c4 is no good. All right, so king to d4, let's say. Okay, but now, all right, and this is just to be funny, just to show a third way that black can draw. So there's perpetual, there's going for this queen versus rook pawn ending, and there are even little stalemate tricks. So queen c3, it's not the only move, but it's a funny one, so I wanted to show you that, because king takes c3 is stalemate. And on king to e4, let's say, check, and we'll check again, check again. Yeah, we don't want to take on f7, because then white queen's too fast. But here, for instance, after queen to e6, now we can even take. And this is a draw. And the reason why this is a draw is because although white can force the king in front of the pawn, the problem is that white doesn't have the chance now to bring his king closer, because if he does, it's an instant stalemate. But without that, without bringing his king closer, there's no win here. So this is a draw. Okay, let me go on to the next example, or the next question. And this is from Kajetan, a Class B player, who writes about this position. He was he was white here. So he says this: during the game, I was very happy with it, my position, and considered it favorable for me. My reasoning was that even though his pieces were more active than mine, I'd be able to improve my pieces quickly enough, while his big weaknesses, the e-pawns, are unfixable. Or his big weakness is unfixable. I thought that he may have had drawing chances exactly because of his piece activity, but surely I'd be the one playing for a win. My liking of white's position got strengthened even further when I managed to win. Imagine my disbelief when I later fed this position to my computer, and it assessed it as dead drawn, and even with black having the microscopically better side of the draw. I know that computers are supposed to be bad at endgames, but hey, they certainly are better than me, so I'm puzzled. I can see only two explanations of this. Either I can't properly weigh static versus dynamic positional factors yet, very plausible, or the computer is wrong. Please judge our dispute and assess the position. Am I right as to white being somewhat better? How would you play with the white pieces? Okay, so very good batch of questions, and I like the way he set the situation up. So yeah, of course he's absolutely right that black's pawns are weak, but white's pieces are quite passive, and that makes a difference. Now, what I would do, and what I tried to do with this position, was to figure out, well, how can I swap off? Well, first of all, I have to get my passive pieces to be unpassive, and or try to swap off his active guys. But it's not really that easy to do it. So, for instance, if you play knight to c3, well, this just loses. So knight c3, rook c3, bishop to b4, and it's just game over. White can throw in a check or two, but then rook takes e1 is winning the bishop, if not mating. So that wasn't very happy. So the next thing I thought was, okay, I'll try king to e2. And here black has any number of ways to play that are completely satisfactory. So one is just to play bishop to f6. So again, preventing knight to c3, or knight to b2 for that matter. And if bishop to c3, well, black can play rook to a2 check and even try to enjoy his initiative, although really there's no winning chances for black either as long as white doesn't blunder. But let's say takes. And this, normally you would think this surely has to favor white. I mean, now we've gotten rid of black's active pieces, and white has those two nice e-pawns to try to do something about. But the problem is, okay, check here, and the only way to get out perpetual is to play king d2, but now rook to g1. And position like this, I mean, it's just a dead draw, very, very easy draw. Black. The only thing black has to do is not trade rooks if the pawn structure stays like this. But there's no way that white can reasonably force that trade. So this is just a very, very simple draw. Now maybe one thing that white could do is to try to set this up where the pawn's already on g3. I'm not sure. I don't really think that's going to be enough either. But that might be a way of trying to proceed. So maybe after bishop to f6, maybe you can play g3, maybe play h4 after that, if you're permitted to, where all the pawns are as secure as possible. But even that, I believe, is really a draw. Okay, and also, of course, black doesn't have to play bishop to f6. So let's say he plays rook to a2 check, rook b2. Okay, rook a3. Not the only move, but again, trying to make it hard for white to get his pieces out. So I'm trying to play knight c3. All right, rook c2. Okay, now rook to a4. And the point of this move is if knight c3, rook c4. So king d1, knight to b4. Okay, if rook c1, knight to d3. And if rook to b2, again, knight to d3. And if anything, black is better here. So white is really getting kind of clumsy. Okay, but white can improve. Rook c8 check. And now knight to c3. Okay, now there's no rook to c4. So it's good times, right? Happy days for white. Now we can start trying to win. Well, it's still not so easy. So knight c3 check. And the good news is we've gotten rid of black's most active piece, or his best minor piece, certainly, after we recapture. The bad news is that now we don't have anything that we can attack the e-pawns with anymore. Our bishop can't do it because his pawns are on light squares. Our rook can't really do it because, well, it can attack the e6 pawn, but the king's protecting it. The e4 pawn, his rook is covering the fourth rank, so we can't approach it. So there's just nothing here. So for instance, if bishop c3, okay, we could just sit, or we can just check, and then this is annoying. And this is just 1000% dead. Black puts the king on d5 or f5 and basically goes to sleep. So you can see the king on f5, pawn on h5, there's just nothing to do. Okay. If rook takes c3, then this is cooperative, but even this is a draw. Bishop to b4 check, and the white bishop can't escape. So takes. So g4, for instance, and even something like this is thoroughly drawn. So I really don't think there's any way to win. I think black's activity is really substantial, and when we're counting up the weaknesses, it looks natural to think that there are two weak black pawns, but really there's only the e4 pawn. I think the e6 pawn is so easily defended with king f7, and it's extremely difficult for white to attack it. So the only potential weakness really is the one on e4, And it looks like black has any number of ways of really keeping that safe. So I don't think, I think in the abstract you're right, that of course, if anyone should be better in the long run, it would be white, but there isn't going to be a long run. I mean, black is just so active that white doesn't get to rearrange his pieces to put any serious pressure against that e4 pawn. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop here. Hope you enjoyed all this. We have some more games that we may cover in the next week or two. But I think we're caught up on the viewer questions anyway, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.